The morning of May 7th, 1943, Korvettenkapitan Herbert Schultze stood in the conning tower of U-48, scanning the horizon through Zeiss binoculars. The Atlantic stretched empty in every direction. No smoke trails, no masts, no aircraft, just endless grey water under overcast skies. Schultze had been hunting convoys for 4 years. He'd sunk 26 Allied merchant ships totalling over 180,000 tons. He wore the Knight's Cross with oak leaves. He was one of Germany's most decorated submarine commanders, and for the first time in his career, he was afraid. Not of depth charges or destroyers or the brutal mathematics of convoy warfare. Schultze feared something he couldn't see, couldn't hear, couldn't detect until it was too late. 3 weeks earlier, the rules of Atlantic combat had changed in ways that made no sense. Ships that should have been blind were finding submarines with impossible accuracy. Aircraft were appearing without warning from Metox radar receivers that had worked perfectly for 18 months. Escorts were coordinating attacks with precision that suggested they could track submerged submarines through methods German intelligence couldn't identify. Something fundamental had shifted. Schultze didn't know what. Nobody did. But the casualty reports told a story more terrifying than any depth charge attack. In April, 15 U-boats had been lost. That was higher than normal, concerning but not catastrophic. In the first week of May alone, another 15 submarines had been destroyed. The loss rate had doubled overnight. Experienced commanders were disappearing. Boats that should have returned to Lorient or Saint-Nazaire simply never arrived. Radio contact ceased. Search aircraft found nothing. Entire crews vanished into the Atlantic without explanation. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commanding U-boat operations from headquarters in Paris, had ordered every available submarine to concentrate against convoy ONS-5 in late April. He'd assembled wolf packs Star and Fink, comprising 43 U-boats total. It was one of the largest concentrations of submarines ever deployed against a single convoy. The battle for ONS-5 had opened on April 28th, when U-650 spotted the merchant ships 400 nautical miles south of Greenland. Dönitz expected a massacre. 43 submarines against 43 merchant ships, escorted by just 7 destroyers and 9 corvettes. Instead, it became a disaster. The convoy lost 13 merchant ships over 6 days of continuous attacks. But the U-boats lost 6 submarines sunk outright, and 7 more damaged so severely they had to abort their patrols. 13% of the attacking force destroyed. Another 16% crippled. In exchange for sinking ships, the Allies could replace within weeks from American shipyards now producing merchant vessels faster than Germany could sink them. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The mathematics were devastating. Previous convoy battles had seen Germany lose 1 or 2 submarines while sinking 15 to 20 merchants. The ratio at ONS-5 had reversed completely. For every merchant sunk, Germany lost half a submarine. That was unsustainable. German shipyards were producing 20 U-boats per month. Losses before May had averaged fewer than 10 boats monthly. The equation had favoured Germany. But if May loss rates continued, Germany would be losing submarines faster than they could build them. The operational U-boat force would shrink instead of grow. The Battle of the Atlantic would be lost not through decisive battle but through arithmetic. Schultze had studied the ONS-5 after-action reports carefully. Commanders described escorts appearing without Metox warning, aircraft attacking at night through heavy cloud cover, depth charge patterns that tracked evasion maneuvers with uncanny accuracy, corvettes coordinating attacks as if they could see submarines beneath the surface. Every report mentioned the same disturbing pattern. Allied detection capabilities had improved dramatically and suddenly. But German intelligence had no explanation. Radio intercepts revealed nothing unusual. Captured equipment showed only familiar radar systems. Agents in Britain reported no new technological deployments. Interrogations of captured Allied sailors produced conflicting stories about detection methods. Some claimed improved sonar. Others mentioned direction-finding equipment. A few whispered about secret devices that could detect submarine diesel exhaust from miles away. None of the stories were consistent. None were verifiable. The intelligence staff at U-boat headquarters documented every incident methodically. By early May 1943, they had recorded 23 separate cases where commanders reported Allied detection without Metox warning. The pattern was undeniable. Something had changed. But what? Either the Metox receivers were failing in ways that couldn't be detected during testing, or the Allies had developed completely new radar systems that German engineers had concluded years earlier were technically impossible. German radar research had explored centimetric wavelengths in the late 1930s. Engineers at Telefunken and other firms had built experimental equipment operating at wavelengths shorter than 1 meter. The conclusion had been unanimous. Centimetric radar was impractical for operational use. Power output was insufficient, detection ranges were too short, components were too unreliable. Vacuum tubes couldn't generate enough energy at frequencies above 600 MHz. The physics simply didn't support effective radar systems at wavelengths shorter than 50 centimeters. British and American engineers must have reached identical conclusions. Basic physics didn't change based on nationality. If German scientists said centimetric radar was impossible, then it was impossible for everyone. The alternative was too disturbing to contemplate. It would mean that German science and engineering, which had led the world in so many fields, had fallen years behind Allied research. It would mean that fundamental assumptions guiding military planning were wrong, that U-boat tactics developed through 4 years of successful operations were obsolete, that every submarine at sea was operating under false premises about what the enemy could detect. Herbert Schultze had served in submarines since 1935. He'd commanded U-48 since October 1939, just weeks after war began. He'd participated in some of the most successful U-boat operations of the entire conflict. In October 1939, he'd sunk the British armed merchant cruiser Rawalpindi, northwest of the Faroe Islands. In November, he'd penetrated British coastal defences and sank 3 merchant ships in the Irish Sea. In December, he'd operated off the Spanish coast, sinking 4 more vessels. Through 1940 and 41, Schultze had refined his tactics. He understood the rhythm of convoy warfare, how to approach undetected on the surface at night, where to position for optimal torpedo shots, when to dive and when to remain surfaced and fight through escort counterattacks with speed and maneuverability. He knew how Allied escorts operated. Their radar operated on 1.5-meter wavelength. Metox receivers could detect that radar at ranges up to 15 kilometers. That gave submarines enough warning to dive or maneuver away before escorts closed to attack range. The system had worked perfectly for 2 years. Metox had saved Schultze's life dozens of times. He'd heard the distinctive warbling tone in his headphones, watched the visual indicator showing signal strength, calculated bearing to the radar source, determined whether to dive or alter course. The Metox gave him eyes that could see over the horizon. It made him feel safe even when operating in heavily patrolled areas. Now that safety was gone. In mid-April, Schultze had been hunting convoy HX-234 southeast of Greenland. His Metox had been functioning normally. He'd detected British patrol aircraft at 14 kilometers, enough time to crash dive to safe depth before the aircraft arrived. Standard procedure. It had worked every time before. But on the night of April 17th, everything changed. Schultze had surfaced after dark to run diesel engines and recharge batteries. The Metox receiver was operating normally. The watch officer scanned the sky continuously with binoculars. Standard night surface procedure. Then, without any warning, without any signal from Metox, a British Wellington bomber appeared at 300 meters altitude. The aircraft's landing lights snapped on. Searchlights illuminated U-48's conning tower. The bomber dropped 6 depth charges before Schultze could give the order to crash dive. The depth charges exploded as U-48 passed through 20 meters depth. The nearest detonation was less than 30 meters from the hull. The shockwave felt like a giant fist punching the submarine. Light bulbs shattered. Cork insulation rained from the overhead. Men were thrown against equipment. The chief engineer reported minor flooding in the aft torpedo room. Nothing catastrophic. But the psychological impact was severe. Schultze had survived because the British bombardier's aim was slightly off. 30 meters was close enough to damage but not destroy. If the depth charges had landed 20 meters closer, U-48 would have been crushed. The entire crew killed instantly. Schultze would have become another name on the casualty list. Another experienced commander lost. Another submarine that simply disappeared without explanation. After making emergency repairs, Schultze had surfaced cautiously. His radio operator sent an encrypted report to U-boat headquarters. British aircraft had attacked without Metox warning. The receiver had been functioning normally before and after the attack. There had been no indication of radar signals, no warning tone, no visual indicator. The aircraft had simply appeared. U-boat headquarters acknowledged the report. Similar incidents were being recorded across the Atlantic. The intelligence staff was investigating. In the meantime, commanders were advised to maintain extra vigilance during night surface operations. Post additional lookouts. Reduce time spent surfaced. That was all the guidance headquarters could provide. They didn't know what was happening either. Schultze had continued his patrol, but with growing unease. The fundamental equation of submarine warfare had changed. For 3 years, U-boats had owned the night. They operated on the surface in darkness. British radar couldn't detect them. British aircraft couldn't find them. British escorts were slower and less maneuverable. German submarines could position themselves ahead of convoys, choose their attack angles, strike from darkness, escape before escorts could respond. That advantage had evaporated. Aircraft were finding surfaced submarines at night with accuracy that suggested they could see in total darkness. Schultze didn't understand how. Neither did anyone else. But the evidence was undeniable. Submarines were being caught on the surface by aircraft that appeared without warning. Commanders who survived reported identical experiences. Metox, silent. Sky, apparently empty. Then suddenly searchlights and depth charges. Some commanders speculated that British aircraft had developed infrared detection systems that could spot submarine diesel exhaust heat. Others thought acoustic sensors might be detecting engine noise from long ranges. A few believed the British had broken German naval codes and were reading U-boat position reports. That would explain how aircraft appeared in exactly the right locations at exactly the right times. None of these theories explained why Metox receivers remained silent. If British aircraft were using radar to guide them to submarines, Metox should detect those signals. Unless the radar operated on frequencies, Metox couldn't receive. But German engineers had explored that possibility and concluded it was impossible. Radar operating at wavelengths shorter than 50 centimeters couldn't generate sufficient power for useful detection ranges. The vacuum tube technology didn't exist. Then, in late April, a rumor started circulating among returning U-boat crews. Several commanders reported that captured British aircrew had mentioned during interrogations that coastal command aircraft were homing in on radiation emitted by Metox receivers themselves. The story spread quickly through U-boat bases at Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, and La Pallice. Officers discussed it in the mess halls. Crew members whispered about it in the barracks. The technical explanation seemed plausible. Superheterodyne receivers like Metox emit weak signals on their intermediate frequency. This was basic radio engineering. Every receiver generated some unintended radiation. Could British aircraft have developed direction-finding equipment sensitive enough to detect Metox emissions from long range? Could that explain why submarines were being found when their receivers were operating? German engineers examined the theory carefully. They confirmed that Metox receivers did emit detectable signals on their intermediate frequency of 455 kHz. Those emissions could be detected at 2 kilometers with specialized equipment under ideal conditions. But for British aircraft to detect them from 20 or 30 kilometers would require receiver sensitivity, 50 decibels, better than anything currently available. It would require large directional antennas several meters in size. Such equipment would be too heavy and bulky for patrol aircraft. The physics didn't really support the claim. But the alternative was even less believable. If British aircraft weren't detecting Metox emissions, they must have developed completely new radar operating on frequencies German receivers couldn't detect. That would mean wavelengths shorter than 60 centimeters. That would mean British engineers had solved problems German scientists had concluded were insoluble. That would mean German radar research had fallen years behind Allied capabilities without anyone noticing. The intelligence staff faced an impossible choice between two equally unlikely explanations. But U-boats were dying. Headquarters needed to give commanders guidance. The decision was made to assume the Metox emission story was true. It fit known physics better than the alternative. It could be tested. It could be countered by simply shutting off the receivers. On May 3, 1943, Admiral Dönitz issued an order to all U-boats at sea. Metox receivers were to be shut off immediately. Better to operate without radar warning than to broadcast position to every British aircraft within 100 kilometers. Commanders were instructed to rely on visual lookouts and maximize time spent submerged. Surface only when absolutely necessary for battery charging. Minimize radio transmissions. Avoid areas with known heavy air patrol activity. The order reached U-48 on May 4, while Schultze was transiting back to Lorient after an unsuccessful patrol. He'd spent 3 weeks hunting convoys without making a single attack. Every time he'd positioned for an approach, escorts had detected his submarine and forced him to dive. Twice he'd been depth-charged severely enough to cause equipment damage. His crew was exhausted, his batteries were worn, his diesel fuel was running low. Schultze read Dönitz's order with a sinking feeling. Shutting off Metox meant operating blind to the one radar system he knew existed. The old British 1.5-meter wavelength ASV that Metox had successfully detected for 2 years was still being used on many patrol aircraft. Without Metox operating, submarines couldn't detect that radar either. They'd be vulnerable to both old and new detection methods. But orders were orders. Schultze instructed his radio operator to shut down the Metox receiver. The distinctive warbling tone that had become a constant background sound during night surface operations went silent. The crew felt more exposed, more vulnerable, like they'd voluntarily blindfolded themselves while crossing a street full of traffic they couldn't see. U-48 reached Lorient on May 9th without further incident. Schultze submitted his patrol report documenting 0 ships sunk, multiple escort contacts, 1 aircraft attack without warning, extensive evasion and hiding, no offensive actions. It was the least successful patrol of his entire career. The debriefing officer noted the details without comment. Other commanders were reporting similar experiences. Successful attacks were becoming rare. Patrol after patrol returned with nothing to show for weeks at sea except equipment wear and crew exhaustion. While U-48 underwent maintenance and reprovisioning, Schultze attended briefings at U-boat headquarters. The intelligence staff presented their current assessment of Allied detection capabilities. They acknowledged that something had changed but couldn't identify what specifically. They presented the Metox emission theory as the most likely explanation. They showed calculations proving British aircraft could theoretically detect Metox signals under ideal conditions from ranges up to 90 kilometers. Schultze listened carefully, but wasn't convinced. The theory had problems. If British aircraft were detecting Metox emissions, why had it taken them 2 years to deploy the capability? Metox had been in use since autumn 1941. If the emissions were detectable, surely the British would have exploited that vulnerability immediately. Why wait until spring 1943? And the theory didn't explain why escorts seemed to be tracking submerged submarines with impossible accuracy. Metox wasn't operating when submarines were underwater, yet depth charge attacks were becoming more precise. Patterns were following evasion maneuvers. Escorts were coordinating in ways that suggested they could see beneath the surface. After the briefing, Schultze spoke privately with Korvettenkapitän Reinhard Suren, another experienced commander who'd just returned from patrol. Suren had sunk 18 merchant ships during 1942. He was aggressive, skilled, and thoroughly trusted his instincts. He told Schultze that Allied detection had changed fundamentally in ways that suggested new technology rather than improved tactics. Suren described his most recent patrol. He'd been hunting convoy SC-128 in mid-May. His wolf pack included 17 submarines. They should have overwhelmed the escort. Instead, 5 U-boats were sunk. 4 more were damaged. 0 merchant ships were destroyed. The escorts achieved perfect defense while inflicting devastating losses. Suren had escaped only because he'd abandoned the attack and dove to maximum depth when escorts appeared to know his exact position despite total darkness and heavy seas. Something was letting Allied forces see submarines regardless of weather, darkness, or evasion tactics. Suren believed it was new radar. Schultze agreed. But neither commander could explain how such radar could exist when German engineers said it was impossible. The truth they didn't know was simpler and more revolutionary than any theory being discussed at U-boat headquarters. On March 17, 1943, British Coastal Command had deployed the first operational ASV Mark III radar on a Wellington bomber. The ASV Mark III operated on 10 cm wavelength, generated by a cavity magnetron. It could detect a surfaced U-boat at 16 kilometers. It could detect a submarine's periscope at 8 kilometers. And the Metox receiver every U-boat carried was completely blind to it. The cavity magnetron had been invented in February 1940 by John Randall and Harry Boot at the University of Birmingham. It solved problems that had frustrated engineers for years. Previous vacuum tubes couldn't generate sufficient power at wavelengths shorter than 50 centimeters. The magnetron used resonant cavities machined into a solid copper block to create powerful microwave oscillations. The first prototype generated 400 watts at 10 centimeter wavelength. That was 50 times more powerful than any previous microwave source. By June 1940, General Electric Company had produced sealed cavity magnetrons suitable for aircraft use. These production units generated peak power of 10 kilowatts in short pulses. That was enough power to build radar systems with detection ranges measured in tens of kilometers. The technology represented a quantum leap in radar capability that changed everything about submarine warfare overnight. The magnetron itself was remarkable for its simplicity and power. It weighed just 400 grams. It was a copper cylinder 8 centimeters in diameter and 6 centimeters tall. Inside were 8 resonant cavities arranged around a central cathode. When energized, electrons spiraled around the cathode in a magnetic field. As electrons passed each cavity opening, they stimulated microwave oscillations that synchronized to produce coherent output at 3000 MHz. The complete ASV Mark III system included the magnetron transmitter, a rotating antenna housed in a bulge beneath the aircraft's fuselage, a receiver unit, 2 cathode ray tube displays, and power supplies. Total weight was 90 kilograms. It required a dedicated operator watching the displays and calling out target contacts to the pilot and bombardier. The system was mechanically complex. It required constant maintenance. Magnetrons had limited operational life, typically 40 to 60 hours before requiring replacement. But when it worked, ASV Mark III transformed anti-submarine warfare completely. An aircraft equipped with the new radar could patrol at night or in heavy weather and detect surfaced U-boats at ranges where visual detection was impossible. The submarine crew had no warning whatsoever until the aircraft was within 1 kilometer. By that time, escape was impossible. A surfaced submarine needed 30 seconds to crash dive to safe depth below 50 meters. Aircraft flying at 200 kilometers per hour could close 1 kilometer in just 15 seconds. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The magnetron had originally been developed for H-2S ground mapping radar, used by Bomber Command for navigation during night raids over Germany. But in early 1943, Winston Churchill personally intervened and ordered that a maritime version be rushed into service. Churchill had been briefed on the March 1943 shipping losses. 82 merchant ships sunk in a single month, over 470,000 tons lost. If March loss rates continued, Britain would be forced to negotiate surrender by autumn. Fuel reserves were down to 3 months. Food stockpiles were at emergency levels. Churchill summoned Air Chief Marshal Philip Joubert on March 25. Joubert explained that Coastal Command had been requesting H-2S radar for over a year, but Bomber Command had priority for all new equipment. Churchill overruled Bomber Command immediately. He issued a direct order that 20% of H-2S production would be diverted to Coastal Command. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris protested vehemently. Churchill told him bluntly that the Battle of the Atlantic took absolute priority. Without Atlantic supply lines secure, Britain would lose the war before bombers could destroy Germany's industrial capacity. The ASV Mark III entered operational service in March 1943. The first successful attack came on March 22 when a Wellington from No. 172 Squadron detected U-665 in the Bay of Biscay. The submarine's Metox gave no warning whatsoever. The aircraft appeared at 300 meters altitude and dropped 6 depth charges before the German crew could react. U-665 survived the attack, but was so badly damaged that the commander aborted the patrol and limped back to La Pallice for repairs that took 6 weeks. Over the next 6 weeks, ASV Mark III equipped aircraft sank 11 U-boats and damaged 23 others severely enough to force them to abort their patrols. Almost none of the submarines detected the radar before being attacked. Metox receivers remained completely silent. U-boat commanders reported in their patrol logs that British aircraft seemed to be using visual detection methods because there was no other rational explanation for finding surfaced submarines at night in total darkness. German intelligence investigated every attack systematically. They analysed patrol reports. They questioned survivors extensively. They examined recovered equipment from damaged submarines. They found nothing unusual. Metox receivers functioned normally when tested. British radar should be operating on the same frequencies it had used for 2 years. There was no indication whatsoever of technological change. The intelligence staff was searching for answers in the wrong place. They were looking for incremental improvements to known systems. They weren't considering the possibility of revolutionary breakthrough technology that German science had concluded was impossible. By mid-May 1943, the pattern had become unmistakable to everyone at U-boat headquarters. Something catastrophic was happening to operational effectiveness. The statistics were devastating beyond anything experienced previously. In May alone, 41 U-boats were lost. That represented 25% of the operational submarine force. Another 37 boats were damaged, some so severely they'd be out of service for months undergoing repairs. In exchange for these losses, submarines had sunk only 58 Allied merchant ships. 34 were sunk in the Atlantic, the others in more peripheral areas like the Indian Ocean and Caribbean. The ratio was completely reversed from previous months. Germany was losing submarines faster than they could sink the ships those submarines were sent to destroy. The mathematics were simple and brutal. German shipyards could eventually replace lost submarines. They were producing 20 boats per month. But they couldn't replace experienced crews. Most commanders, killed in May, were combat veterans with multiple successful patrols. Their knowledge, tactical instincts, and ability to read situations and make split-second decisions under pressure couldn't be replaced by fresh graduates from submarine school. The U-boat force was losing its institutional memory faster than it could train replacements. New crews were technically proficient. They understood navigation, torpedo mechanics, diesel maintenance, and emergency procedures. But they had no combat experience. They didn't know how to feel when a situation was developing wrong. They didn't know when to attack aggressively and when to evade cautiously. They didn't know how to survive. Herbert Schultze recognized what was happening. He'd seen it before in other contexts. When a military force loses too many experienced personnel too quickly, effectiveness collapses regardless of equipment quality or numerical strength. The skills that keep submarines alive through combat can't be taught in classroom lectures or training exercises. They're learned through experience, refined through repeated exposure to actual combat conditions, passed down from veteran commanders to new officers through mentorship and example. May 1943 was destroying that knowledge base faster than it could regenerate. Every experienced commander killed took with him years of accumulated tactical wisdom. Every crew that died represented thousands of hours of collective experience that couldn't be replaced. The U-boat force was being hollowed out from within. Soon there would be nothing left except inexperienced crews operating sophisticated boats they didn't know how to use effectively in combat. On May 24, 1943, Admiral Dönitz made the hardest decision of his career. He sent an encrypted signal to all U-boats in the Atlantic. The message was brief and devastating. Withdraw from convoy routes immediately. Return to base. Suspend all offensive operations until further notice. The Battle of the Atlantic was effectively over. Germany had lost. In his war diary entry for May 24th, Dönitz wrote carefully chosen words that captured his frustration and confusion. We are at present facing the greatest crisis in submarine warfare since the enemy has rendered fighting impossible through use of location devices and is causing us heavy losses. He didn't know what those devices were, specifically. He didn't know exactly how they worked. He didn't know how to counter them effectively. All he knew with certainty was that submarines couldn't operate successfully anymore in the Atlantic. Continuing to send boats against convoys was throwing away crews and submarines for no meaningful gain. Better to withdraw, analyze what had changed, develop new tactics and countermeasures, and return when Germany had answers. But the withdrawal order essentially conceded that the U-boat offensive that had nearly starved Britain into submission was over. For 3.5 years, German submarines had terrorized Atlantic convoy routes. They'd sunk 2,300 Allied merchant ships, totaling over 11 million tons. They'd killed 30,000 merchant seamen. They'd come within weeks of cutting Britain's supply lines completely. Churchill himself admitted later that the U-boat threat was the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire war. Everything else, German bombers, invasion threats, defeats in North Africa, could be managed or recovered from. But if the U-boats succeeded in cutting the Atlantic lifeline, Britain would be forced to surrender regardless of courage or determination. And that threat had been stopped by a 10-centimeter radar system the Germans didn't know existed and couldn't detect with any equipment they possessed. Herbert Schultze received the withdrawal order while U-48 was still in port. He wouldn't return to sea. His combat career was over. He'd be assigned to training duties, passing his knowledge to new commanders who would face challenges he couldn't prepare them for. The war he'd learned to fight no longer existed. The tactics he'd mastered were obsolete. The instincts he'd developed through years of experience were based on assumptions that were no longer valid. The truth began emerging slowly through multiple channels. In early September 1943, German naval intelligence obtained partial information about Allied centimetric radar from a captured document recovered from a downed bomber. The document referenced a radar system called ASV Mark III. It mentioned 10-centimeter wavelength operation. It provided performance specifications that seemed impossible, but turned out to be accurate. On September 4th, Telefunken delivered the first Naxos radar warning receivers to U-boat bases. Naxos could detect centimetric radar signals. It operated between 2500 and 3750 MHz, covering the 10-centimeter band British aircraft were using. Finally, German submarines had a way to detect ASV Mark III before it could guide aircraft to attack positions. But it was far too late. By September 1943, Allied anti-submarine forces had grown so powerful that even with radar warning, U-boats couldn't operate safely in the Atlantic. Very long-range B-24 Liberator bombers had closed the mid-Atlantic air gap. Escort carriers provided continuous air cover over convoys. Hunter-killer groups with the latest sonar and radar actively sought submarines instead of just defending merchants. Allied shipyards were launching new escort vessels, and merchant ships faster than U-boats could sink them. Naxos revealed what had been killing U-boats for 5 months. Operators reported detecting 10-centimeter radar at ranges up to 8 kilometers. That was enough warning to crash dive before most aircraft could close to attack range. But Naxos was temperamental. It suffered from constant false alarms. Its extreme sensitivity made it detect signals from ships and aircraft too far away to pose immediate threats. This caused unnecessary crash dives that wasted precious battery power and interrupted patrols. Many commanders found Naxos almost as frustrating as having no warning system at all. The fundamental problem was that submarines had lost their primary tactical advantage permanently. For 3 years, U-boats had operated on the surface at night, invisible to Allied radar, faster than escort ships, able to position themselves for optimal attacks. That advantage was completely gone. Centimetric radar could detect surfaced submarines at night as easily as in daylight. U-boats were forced to operate submerged for most of each patrol. That cut their speed from 17 knots to 7 knots. It reduced operational range by more than half. It made intercepting fast convoys nearly impossible. Battery endurance became the critical limitation. A Type 7C submarine carried 2 banks of 62 cell batteries. At maximum submerged speed of 7.6 knots, batteries exhausted in 90 minutes. At economical speed of 4 knots, endurance extended to 80 hours. But 80 hours submerged meant 80 hours of severely limited mobility, no ventilation, no battery charging, and no opportunity to maneuver for attacks. When batteries finally exhausted, submarines had to surface and run diesel engines to recharge. That process took 4 to 6 hours. During that time, they were completely vulnerable to radar detection. The operational cycle became self-reinforcing and ultimately fatal. Submarines stayed submerged to avoid radar detection. Staying submerged exhausted batteries rapidly. Surfacing to recharge exposed them to radar again. Diving to evade detected aircraft used even more battery power. Running submerged to and from operational areas consumed battery capacity that could have been reserved for the return transit. Boats were spending more time hiding than hunting. Patrol effectiveness dropped by more than half. By the end of 1943, U-boat operations had effectively become extended suicide missions. New submarines were being sent into the Atlantic with inexperienced crews who had absolutely no idea how to fight against Allied technological superiority. Loss rates climbed above 50%. Some boats were sunk on their first patrol before even reaching operational areas. The average lifespan of a U-boat operating in the Atlantic had dropped to less than 3 months. For comparison, the average lifespan in 1942 had been over a year. Training couldn't compensate for the technological imbalance. U-boat school at Neustadt turned out new crews every month, but they received only 12 weeks of training before operational assignment. 12 weeks to learn navigation, torpedo tactics, damage control, diesel maintenance, radio procedure, and hundreds of other essential skills that experienced crews had, refined over years of actual operations. New crews were technically proficient in classroom knowledge, but they had no combat instincts whatsoever. They didn't know how to read developing tactical situations. They didn't know when to attack and when to evade. They didn't know how to survive in an environment where the enemy could see them, but they were effectively blind. Experienced commanders who survived and rotated back to training duties tried desperately to warn new crews, but there was no way to adequately prepare them for what they would face. The old tactics that had worked brilliantly through 1942 simply didn't work anymore. Doctrine developed through years of successful operations was completely obsolete. U-boat headquarters couldn't provide better tactical guidance because they still didn't fully understand what had changed or how to effectively counter it. They knew British aircraft had centimetric radar. They knew it was making night surface operations suicidal, but they didn't have effective countermeasures beyond telling commanders to stay submerged as much as possible and avoid areas with heavy air patrol activity. Herbert Schultze survived the war. He never returned to combat operations after May 1943. He spent the remainder of the war at training commands, teaching new officers tactics that he knew were outdated, but teaching them anyway because there was nothing else to teach. After Germany surrendered, Schultze was briefly held by British authorities, then released. He returned to Germany, found work in civilian maritime industries, and rarely spoke about his wartime experiences in detail. The ASV Mark III radar remained classified until well after the war ended. German intelligence never fully understood during the war what exactly happened during May 1943. They knew British aircraft had developed some form of new radar. They eventually confirmed it operated on centimetric wavelengths, but they never realized how early it had been deployed or how completely it changed the tactical situation almost overnight. German naval records from May 1943 are filled with references to unknown Allied detection methods and mysterious location equipment that couldn't be identified. The confusion and uncertainty are evident in every after-action report. British Coastal Command eventually published detailed statistics on ASV Mark III effectiveness. From March through July 1943, aircraft equipped with the new radar sank 37 U-boats outright. They seriously damaged 49 others that had to abort patrols. That represented over half of all U-boat losses during that entire period. Most attacks came without any warning whatsoever. Crews who survived reported that radar detectors gave no indication of approaching aircraft until far too late to dive to safety. Germans eventually developed their own centimetric radar. The Berlin series equipment, based on a captured British magnetron recovered from a downed bomber in February 1943, entered limited service on U-boats in late 1944, but by then the Battle of the Atlantic was long over. The submarines it was installed on were mostly being used for weather reporting missions and transporting critical supplies to isolated garrisons, not for convoy attacks. The technology came far too late to change anything strategically. Admiral Dönitz remained convinced throughout the rest of the war that a combination of multiple factors defeated his U-boats in May 1943: better Allied training, improved tactics, more escort ships and aircraft deployed, closing of the mid-Atlantic air gap, better sonar equipment, more accurate depth charges. He acknowledged that centimetric radar was part of the answer, but he never fully grasped how singularly decisive it had been. He thought it was one element among many contributing factors. He didn't realize it was the primary factor that rendered his entire tactical doctrine obsolete virtually overnight. The final statistics tell the story with brutal clarity. In March 1943, U-boats sank 82 Allied merchant ships in the Atlantic. They lost 12 submarines. That was a ratio of almost 7-1 in Germany's favor. The mathematics supported continued operations. In April 1943, they sank 39 merchant ships and lost 15 submarines. The ratio dropped to roughly 2.5-1. Still marginally acceptable but concerning. In May 1943, they sank 34 merchant ships and lost 41 submarines. The ratio had completely reversed. For every merchant vessel sunk, Germany lost more than one submarine. The mathematics no longer supported operations at all. After May, the ratio never again favored U-boats. By the end of 1943, it took more than 3 submarine patrols on average to sink a single merchant ship. By 1944, it was closer to 5 patrols per ship sunk. The U-boat force kept fighting until the very end of the war in Europe. But they never again threatened Allied convoy routes seriously. The offensive capability that had nearly won the Battle of the Atlantic had been broken in a single month by a radar system operating on a wavelength German receivers couldn't detect and German scientists had concluded was impossible to build. That's precisely how wars are won in the modern era. Not through massive, decisive battles or brilliant strategic maneuvers alone, but through small technological advantages that one side possesses and effectively exploits, while the other side doesn't even know those advantages exist until far too late. ASV Mark III wasn't a wonder weapon. It was a modest but crucial improvement over existing radar technology, made possible by a new type of vacuum tube that could generate shorter wavelengths at useful power levels. But deployed at exactly the moment in the campaign against an enemy who didn't know it existed and couldn't detect it with any equipment they had, that modest improvement changed the entire course of the war at sea. The German U-boat force never recovered from May 1943. The technological surprise was complete. The strategic impact was decisive, and the men who died never understood what killed them. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.